When you search online for information about the angled flight deck, when you watch documentaries about naval aviation, when you read military history books, when you listen to podcasts about aviation innovation, when you explore YouTube content about carrier operations, you encounter a story. The same story, told the same way, repeated across hundreds of different platforms by thousands of different creators with only minor variations in how it's presented. The narrative is remarkably consistent. The details are similar. The dramatic moments are identical. The emotional beats hit the same way every single time. The story is told the exact same way across documentaries, articles, videos, podcasts, books. It's almost like people are copying from the same source or sharing the same basic script. It's a compelling story. That's undeniable. It has all the elements that make history engaging to general audiences. It has a brilliant protagonist with clear vision. It has a dramatic problem that seems impossible to solve. It has a moment of genius and inspiration. It has institutional resistance that must be overcome. It has triumph and transformation. This is the story people tell about Captain Dennis Cambell and the angled flight deck. This is the narrative that has been repeated so many times across so many platforms that most people believe it's historical fact. Most people accept it as established truth. Most people have never questioned whether it's accurate. Most people have never wondered if they're getting the real story or a dramatized version. But when I started researching this story in depth, when I dug into primary sources, when I read original naval documents, when I reviewed archived records from the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy and various aviation museums, when I consulted official government records, when I looked at contemporary accounts from 1951 and 1952, I discovered that much of what people say about this story is either inaccurate or significantly dramatized or presented in misleading context. Some of it is partially true but severely dramatized beyond recognition. Some of it is completely false and has no basis in historical fact. Some of it is borrowed from other historical stories and incorrectly attached to this one. Some of it is technically true but presented in a misleading context that changes the meaning. Some of it is attributed to the wrong person. Some of it happened at the wrong time. So today, I'm going to do what most history channels don't do on YouTube. I'm going to compare systematically what people are claiming happened with what actually happened according to verified historical records. I'm going to examine the differences. I'm going to explain why those differences matter. I'm going to explore what we can learn from understanding the difference between myth and truth. In virtually every popular version of this story, the opening section begins exactly the same way, with a crisis. People describe carrier landings in the early 1950s as an absolute disaster situation. They describe it as a crisis. They say the situation was dire and desperate. They claim pilots were dying constantly. Multiple pilots every single month. Some versions claim dozens of pilots dying in landing accidents. Some versions suggest that the death rate from landing accidents was higher than the death rate from actual combat operations. The popular narrative describes landing gear failures happening regularly, aircraft crashing into barriers, ships exploding into fire, massive casualties. They describe it like it was complete chaos, like it was a disaster unfolding, like it was an emergency that threatened the entire carrier aviation program, like the program was on the verge of collapse. When you watch documentaries that present this narrative, they show archival footage of aircraft crashing. They show smoke and fire and explosions. They describe statistics in ways that make it sound like every single carrier landing was a near-death experience. Like pilots were essentially gambling with their lives every time they attempted to land on a carrier. Like going through a carrier landing was like playing Russian roulette. The narrative creates a sense of urgency and desperation. The story suggests that unless something changed immediately, the program would fail completely. The situation was unsustainable. It was untenable. It was unacceptable. Something had to be done. Something had to change. And fast. This crisis framing serves a specific narrative purpose. It makes the need for innovation seem urgent and necessary. It makes the solution seem more dramatic. It makes the hero's journey more compelling. It raises the stakes. It makes people feel that this was a critical moment in history. But when you examine the actual data carefully, when you look at what the historical records actually show, the crisis narrative doesn't quite match reality in the way it's usually presented. Yes, carrier landings were dangerous. That's absolutely true. There's no dispute about that. There's no argument about that. Landing an aircraft on a moving ship that's pitching and rolling and moving in multiple directions simultaneously on the open ocean in all kinds of weather is inherently risky. That's basic physics. That's aerodynamics. That's operational reality. That's never going to be completely safe. That's never going to be risk-free. But the danger came from something very specific, a fundamental architectural design problem, not from some general crisis of equipment failure or pilot incompetence or some mysterious phenomenon that nobody could explain. The real architectural problem was this. The straight deck design created a fundamental operational conflict between safety equipment and launch equipment. There was a built-in contradiction in the design. When an aircraft approaches to land on a straight deck, it's coming in fast. It might overshoot the intended landing spot. The pilot might lose control. The aircraft might fail to catch the arresting wires properly. The aircraft might come down hard and bounce over the wires. Any of these things could happen. So, to handle this possibility, the straight deck design required a safety barrier. This was a wall of cables and netting and steel framework. It was positioned behind where the arresting wires were located. If an aircraft overshot the wires, if it slid past them, it would hit this barrier and the barrier would catch it and stop it. This barrier was absolutely necessary for safety. It was an essential safety feature. It prevented overshooting aircraft from hitting other aircraft on the deck. It prevented them from hitting the bridge. It prevented them from causing catastrophic damage to the ship. It protected personnel working on the deck. It saved lives. But here's where the fundamental conflict emerges. If you're operating a carrier in combat conditions or in training exercises, you need to be able to launch new aircraft while you're simultaneously recovering landing aircraft. That's how carrier operations work in reality. That's how you maximize your operational capability. That's how you maintain tactical effectiveness. You can't afford to stop everything. You can't afford to shut down all launching. You can't afford to wait for one plane to land, then clear the deck, then start launching again. That would be tactically inefficient. That would be operationally disadvantageous. That would cripple your effectiveness. That would reduce your capability. But the safety barrier that catches overshooting aircraft is positioned exactly where you need to launch new aircraft from. The barrier takes up the space behind the arresting wires. You can't launch aircraft from the area behind the arresting wires because the barrier is there. You can't have new aircraft taking off from an area that has a massive safety barrier in it. So you had this fundamental conflict. The safety equipment that protected the deck was positioned in the exact area where you needed to launch aircraft from. You couldn't do both simultaneously. You couldn't have simultaneous launch and recovery operations happening at the same time. This meant that during flight operations, the carrier commander had a choice. Either you were launching aircraft or you were recovering aircraft. You could do one or the other, but you absolutely could not do both at the same time. There was no way around it. It was built into the architecture. If you wanted to recover an aircraft that was damaged or running low on fuel, you had to stop all launching operations. You had to position the barrier properly. You had to let the aircraft land. You had to wait for it to come to a complete stop. You had to then remove the barrier, reposition your launching aircraft, and resume launches. This cycle meant operational inefficiency. This meant lost operational capability. This meant reduced effectiveness. This meant that carriers couldn't operate at full capacity during all phases of operations. That's the real architectural problem. Not random explosions. Not mysterious crashes. Just an architectural design issue that prevented simultaneous launch and recovery operations. That's it. The casualty statistics that people cite in documentaries? They're based on real naval records. The accident numbers are real. They're documented. Pilots did die in landing accidents. But the numbers were consistent with the inherent risks of operating jet aircraft from a moving, pitching deck at sea. The numbers were not consistent with some unique, unprecedented crisis that only the angled deck could solve. The 80% crash reduction that people cite repeatedly, that's real. That's documented in official records. But it didn't happen because landing suddenly became magically safe through one innovation. It happened because the architectural problem was solved, which allowed for safer, more controlled, more efficient operational procedures. It happened because pilots could now operate in an environment where simultaneous launch and recovery was possible. Here's how popular versions of this story describe the invention moment. They describe Cambell as a lone genius who has an epiphany. They suggest that one day, Cambell sits down and sketches a solution on paper, and suddenly everything changes. They describe it like a moment of inspiration, like a bolt from the blue. The narrative emphasizes his uniqueness, his visionary thinking, his ability to see what nobody else sees, his brilliance. They describe him working against institutional resistance. They suggest he had to convince skeptical bureaucrats that his crazy idea would actually work. They suggest he faced opposition. They suggest doubt. They suggest he had to overcome resistance. This is the classic hero's journey applied to military technology. A brilliant individual who challenges conventional thinking and transforms the world. It's a proven narrative formula that works again and again. It sells books. It gets millions of views on YouTube. It inspires people. It makes people believe that individual genius can overcome institutional inertia. But this narrative, while compelling and emotionally satisfying, isn't what actually happened in this case. The actual story begins with a formal meeting at the UK Ministry of Supply on August 7, 1951. This wasn't Cambell having a private inspiration moment sitting alone in his office late at night. This wasn't an isolated genius moment in isolation. This was an official government meeting. It was organized formally. It had a clear agenda. It had multiple participants. It was part of an institutional process that was designed to address a specific, technical problem that had been officially recognized as needing institutional attention and resources. Present at this meeting were naval officers. Present were engineers from the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. Present were government officials. This wasn't a casual discussion. This wasn't informal brainstorming. This was a formal meeting designed with a specific purpose, to address a specific technical problem. Captain Dennis Cambell, who was the Deputy Chief Naval Representative at this meeting, was participating in this discussion. During this formal meeting, he sketched a flight deck angled approximately 10 degrees to port. This sketch was significant, but not because it represented some solo inspiration moment that nobody else had thought of. It was significant because it was presented in a room full of experienced engineers and naval officials who immediately recognized its potential. It was significant because it was the right idea at the right time within an institutional structure designed to evaluate ideas and implement them. The sketch was a contribution to a collaborative process, not a solo invention by a lone genius. Present at this meeting was Louis Boddington from the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. Boddington wasn't a passive listener. He was an engineer. His job was to take conceptual ideas and formalize them into technical specifications and engineering drawings that could actually be implemented in the real world. Within 3 weeks of this meeting, on August 28, 1951, Boddington had produced formal engineering drawings of the angled deck concept. These weren't rough sketches. These weren't preliminary concepts. These were official technical documents with precise measurements, specific angles, detailed dimensions. These drawings included specifications for what would be required to implement the concept. These drawings were the bridge between concept and practical reality. Also at this meeting was Commander Nick Goodhart. Goodhart wasn't just passively participating in the discussion. He was actively developing what would become equally revolutionary technology, an optical landing aid system. This was the technology that would eventually become the Fresnel lens system that guides pilots onto carrier decks. Goodhart understood that a rotated deck alone wasn't sufficient. Pilots needed optical guidance to land precisely on an angled surface. Pilots needed visual feedback about their approach. So Goodhart was actively working on the technology that would make the angled deck operationally effective. So the angled deck didn't emerge from one man's genius working in isolation. It emerged from institutional collaboration. It emerged from a formal institutional process. It emerged from multiple specialists contributing their expertise in a coordinated way. Cambell contributed the conceptual idea. Boddington contributed the engineering formalization. Goodhart contributed the supporting technology that would make the angled deck operationally effective and usable by pilots. All of them were working within an organizational structure, the Ministry of Supply, that was designed to evaluate and implement naval innovations. They were working within a system. They were part of a larger process. They were contributors to something larger than themselves. This is a crucial point where the myth completely unravels because people get a fundamental fact completely wrong. They get the ship wrong. If you watch documentaries about the angled flight deck, you'll see claims that the tests were conducted on HMS Illustrious. You'll find this claim in YouTube videos. You'll see it repeated in online articles. You'll find it in books about aviation history. You'll hear it in podcasts about military history. It sounds dramatic. HMS Illustrious is a legendary ship. She was a World War II-era British aircraft carrier. She has a storied history. She was involved in major naval operations. She participated in significant battles. She was a famous and respected ship, so the narrative makes intuitive sense. The legendary Illustrious, a famous warship with a glorious military history, is brought back for one more crucial mission. She's brought out of retirement to test this revolutionary new landing concept that will change naval aviation forever. It's good storytelling. It connects the old Navy to the new Navy. It adds historical weight and gravitas. It makes the story more dramatic and emotionally resonant. It suggests continuity and legacy and tradition. It suggests that the legendary ship played one more important and historic role. But it's completely wrong. It's factually incorrect. It's a false claim that's been repeated so many times that people believe it. HMS Illustrious was a World War II armored carrier. She was designed with heavy armor plating to protect against enemy attack and bombing. She was fitted with propeller-driven aircraft systems. She was designed for the aviation requirements of World War II, not for the jet age. She was an excellent ship for her era, but by 1951 she was technologically obsolete for jet operations. Her entire design was built around piston-engine aircraft. Her systems were optimized for slower aircraft speeds. Her arresting gear was designed for lower-speed landings. Her catapults were designed for slower aircraft acceleration. Her infrastructure assumed lower operational speeds and less powerful aircraft. Using HMS Illustrious for high-speed jet aircraft trials would have been like trying to test a modern computer on 1940s computer hardware. It would have been technically impossible. It would have been operationally unsuitable. It would have been dangerous to the pilots and the equipment. It would have been a waste of institutional resources. HMS Triumph, by contrast, was a modern carrier designed and built for jet operations. She was designed for the jet age. She had the infrastructure to support high-speed jet aircraft. She had modern arresting gear systems capable of handling the massive kinetic energy of fast-moving jets. She had updated catapults. She had modern systems throughout, so in September 1951, just weeks after Cambell's sketch and Boddington's engineering drawings, personnel from the Royal Aircraft Establishment and the Royal Navy traveled to HMS Triumph for the first operational test of the angled deck. What they did was deceptively simple but brilliantly pragmatic. They painted a line on the flight deck. This wasn't a sophisticated technological test. This wasn't a complex engineering experiment. It was direct. It was practical. It was elegant in its simplicity. For years, pilots had been landing on straight decks. That was the only way they knew. That was what they had trained for. That was what their muscle memory was built around. Now, the fundamental question was, could pilots successfully land on a deck that was angled? So they painted an 8 to 10 degree angled approach line directly onto HMS Triumph's existing flight deck. This created a visual reference for pilots. This created a painted simulation of what an actual structural modification would look like. This did not require any structural modification to the ship. This did not require any expensive physical changes. This was simple, practical, effective. Then pilots flew approaches to this painted line. Real pilots flying real aircraft making real landings on a real carrier with a painted angle on the deck. This wasn't a simulation. This wasn't a theoretical exercise. This was actual operational testing. This is where the narrative about pilot resistance comes in. And this is where the myth diverges most clearly from the actual historical record. Popular versions claimed that pilots resisted the angled deck. They say pilots thought it was crazy. They say pilots had to overcome massive psychological resistance before they would attempt to land on the angled line. They suggest that pilots were skeptical. They suggest that pilots were afraid. The narrative goes, pilots had spent years landing on straight decks. This was the only method they knew. Their entire training was based on straight deck approaches. Their muscle memory was built around that approach pattern. Their psychological comfort zone was based on that specific technique. When you tell someone to suddenly change their entire technique, to do something that contradicts everything they've been taught, to abandon the approach pattern that's been drilled into them, there's supposed to be natural resistance. There's supposed to be hesitation. There's supposed to be fear. There's supposed to be psychological difficulty. So the popular story claims that pilots looked at the angled line and said no. That pilots thought this was madness. That it took courage and persuasion and institutional pressure to get pilots to even attempt it. This adds drama to the story. It makes the pilots seem heroic. It makes the story seem like there was a psychological barrier that had to be overcome in addition to the technical barrier. It makes the pilots seem brave. But that's not what actually happened. That's not what the historical record shows. When pilots actually flew approaches to the painted angled line on HMS Triumph, something unexpected happened. At least unexpected according to the popular myth. They didn't reject it. They didn't resist it. They didn't require extensive persuasion. They adapted to it almost immediately. And more importantly, they understood why it was better. They recognized the advantages. The Royal Navy and Royal Aircraft Establishment records from these trials document that pilots reported no drift issues. They didn't struggle psychologically. They didn't need lengthy retraining. They didn't require institutional pressure. They adapted rapidly. But why? Why would pilots so quickly accept and adapt to something so different from everything they'd been trained on? Because there was an immediate psychological and practical advantage that pilots recognized instinctively the moment they attempted the angled approach. With a straight deck approach, if a pilot developed drift during the final approach, if they were drifting left or right relative to the deck, they couldn't see where that drift was taking them clearly. They couldn't visually track their own positional error precisely. They were essentially flying blind relative to their own error. The optical illusions created by landing on a moving ship, the perspective distortions created by the specific approach angle, meant that pilots couldn't always judge their lateral position accurately. With an angled approach, pilots could see the angle clearly. The visual reference was immediate and obvious and continuous throughout the approach. If they started drifting from that angle, they could see it happening in real time. They could make corrections. They could control their position relative to the deck. This wasn't a difficult psychological transition that required extensive retraining and institutional support. This was pilots recognizing an immediate, obvious, dramatic improvement in their ability to see their own position and control their approach. Here's another common narrative repeated across multiple sources and platforms. Cambell and the British had to convince America that this crazy idea would work. Americans were supposedly skeptical. Americans didn't trust British innovation. There was supposedly hesitation. There was supposedly doubt. There were supposedly high-level meetings where American naval leadership argued against implementation. Some versions of this story suggest it took months or even years to convince Americans. Some suggest there was institutional resistance within the U.S. Navy. Some suggest that American naval leadership didn't want to admit that a better idea had come from outside the U.S. Navy. The narrative implies that if Cambell hadn't been persuasive, if British advocates hadn't presented the data compellingly, if they hadn't been able to overcome American institutional skepticism, America might never have adopted the angled deck. This story serves a narrative purpose. It makes the British innovators seem like they had to overcome not just technical challenges but also institutional politics and national pride and bureaucratic resistance. It adds narrative drama and tension, but the timeline tells a completely different story than the popular myth suggests. By autumn 1952, less than a year after the HMS Triumph painted deck tests in September 1951, American naval officials were already conducting full-scale trials on American carriers. There were trials on USS Midway. There were trials on USS Antietam. Royal Navy advisors and observers were present at these American tests. They were present not because the Americans needed to be convinced by British advocates, but because both navies understood this was a joint evaluation of a technology that would affect all Western carriers. This was collaboration between allies, not persuasion of skeptics. This wasn't American resistance being overcome through argument and data presentation. This was rapid institutional adoption once the data existed and was evaluated jointly. In December 1952, less than a year after the painted deck trials, USS Antietam became the first operational carrier fitted with a permanent, structural angled deck. This wasn't a limited test installation. This wasn't a temporary modification. This was a permanent modification to an operational aircraft carrier, 8 degrees to port, exactly as specified in Boddington's engineering drawings. Then, formal evaluation began in January 1953 in the Caribbean. Real-world testing of the angled deck under actual operational conditions. Pilots flying real missions. Recovering aircraft under combat realistic conditions. Data collection. Systematic evaluation. The results were successful. The data was clear. The operational advantages were undeniable. And the U.S. Navy began fleet-wide retrofits starting in 1954 and continuing through 1957. Every major American carrier got the angled deck. Every Western Ally carrier got the angled deck. This wasn't hesitation. This wasn't skepticism being overcome through clever argument. This was rapid recognition of superior technology and rapid implementation across the fleet. This is one of the most commonly cited statistics in the angled deck story. After the angled deck was implemented, carrier landing crashes dropped by 80%. People described this like it was a miracle. People suggest that the moment you installed an angled deck on a carrier, crashes instantly dropped by 80%. Some versions imply this happened on the first day operations began with the angled deck. Some suggest the first week. Some suggest the first month. The narrative is, here's this simple architectural solution, and it's so effective that it immediately transformed carrier operations completely. It's almost like magic. One architectural change and suddenly an entire category of accident is essentially eliminated. Crashes drop by 80%. It's instantaneous. It's dramatic. It's transformative. This narrative feeds into the hero's story. It makes the solution seem brilliant because it's so immediately effective. It makes Cambell seem like a genius because his idea had such immediate, dramatic, transformative impact. But the reality is more nuanced and more accurate to how technology and organizational systems actually work. Here's what the actual data shows from official naval records. Royal Navy reports from the post-1953 period and U.S. Navy reports from the same era document approximately 70 to 80% reduction in landing accidents after angled deck. Implementation. That's a real number. That's based on actual statistics from official records. The 70 to 80% figure is documented and genuine. But this reduction didn't happen overnight. It wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't magical. It happened gradually over years as multiple systems matured simultaneously and as the entire operational system improved. The angled deck was one piece of a larger, more complex solution. It was necessary but not sufficient by itself. There were other innovations that matured at the same time. Arresting gear systems improved significantly. Better cables, better hydraulic mechanisms, better energy absorption systems. Equipment got more sophisticated and more reliable. The entire system of catching aircraft improved. Optical landing aids became more refined and more effective. The Fresnel lens system, that technology Nick Goodhart had been developing, became standard across the entire fleet. This gave pilots much better visual guidance about their approach angle. This gave pilots much better optical feedback about their position. Pilot training adapted to the new approach geometry. Training programs were redesigned completely from the ground up. Training shifted focus from straight approaches to angled approaches. Pilots practiced the new technique. Pilots learned the new skills. This wasn't minor retraining. This was comprehensive restructuring of how pilots were taught to land on carriers. Systematic data collection became standard across all carriers. Naval officers started tracking every landing incident. They tracked every near miss. They tracked every accident. This created data. This created feedback loops. This created information that informed continuous improvement. All of these things combined together. They accumulated. They interacted with each other. The result was a 70 to 80% reduction in accidents over time. The 80% figure is directionally accurate based on official records, but it represents years of accumulated improvement and systematic implementation, not instantaneous magical transformation. Why do we tell myths instead of truth? Why is the simplified version of the angled deck story so much more popular than the real version? First, myths are simpler. A myth gives you one protagonist, one clear problem, one solution. Your brain can hold on to it easily. You can remember it. You can retell it to someone else. You can teach it to children. You can communicate it effectively in a short amount of time. The real story is more complex. It involves multiple people. It involves institutional structures. It involves formal processes. It involves distributed decision-making. Your brain has to work harder to understand it. It takes longer to explain. It requires more nuance. Second, myths are emotionally satisfying. The hero's journey, a single brilliant individual overcoming obstacles and transforming the world, is a narrative pattern that humans find deeply satisfying. We've been telling stories like this since the beginning of human civilization. Our brains are wired to respond to this narrative pattern. The real story, multiple people working within institutional structures, following formal processes, collecting data, making decisions, implementing solutions, is less emotionally resonant. It doesn't inspire in the same way. It doesn't touch the same emotional chords. Third, myths are aspirational. The hero's journey suggests that one individual can make a difference. That, if you have a good idea, if you're smart enough, if you're creative enough, you can change everything. The real story, that innovation happens through institutional collaboration, is less inspiring in some ways. It suggests that individual genius isn't enough. You need organizational support. You need formal processes. You need institutional backing. That's less inspiring. That's less empowering for individuals. Fourth, myths are easier to market. If you're writing a book, if you're making a documentary, if you're creating content for YouTube, the hero's journey is a proven formula. Audiences understand it. Audiences are drawn to it. It's easier to sell. The complex institutional story? It's harder to dramatize. It's harder to make visually interesting. It's harder to sell to audiences. So there are structural reasons why myths persist, even when the truth is available and accessible. But here's why. Understanding the truth matters more than accepting the myth. The real story of the angled deck teaches us something crucial about how real innovation actually works in the real world. It happens through collaboration. It happens through systematic testing. It happens through institutional structures that can recognize good ideas and implement them rapidly. Real innovation is not about genius moments. It's about how organizations can respond to problems and coordinate solutions, and that lesson applies far beyond aviation. Every innovation you interact with, every technology, every medicine, every process, every system that you use in your daily life was created through institutional collaboration. The iPhone wasn't invented by Steve Jobs alone. It was created by teams of engineers, designers, materials scientists, software developers, all coordinated within Apple's institutional structure. Modern vaccines aren't invented by one brilliant scientist. They're created by teams of immunologists, chemists, engineers, manufacturing specialists, all working within institutional frameworks at universities and pharmaceutical companies. When you understand that innovation is institutional collaboration, not individual genius, you understand something fundamental about how the modern world actually works.